Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're cracking open a review of the 2012 thriller Break. It's one of those films that, well, it manages to scare you senseless while basically never leaving this tiny plastic box. So our mission today is to figure out how the director, Gabe Torres, and the star, Stephen Dorff, took this extreme limitation and turned it into, like, 90 minutes of pure tension. And the core idea, the thing that really jumped out from the source material, is the psychological question. If you're pushed into an absolutely extreme situation, survival mode, how do you actually cope? I mean, nobody really knows until they're actually there, right?
Exactly. And Jeremy Reins, Stephen Dorff's character, the Secret Service agent, he's shoved right past that breaking point from minute one. He just wakes up, sealed inside this Perspex box. It's barely big enough to even sit up in. Zero memory of how he got there, just total confinement. And then there's this sound, this horrible ticking timer right outside. It's immediate, primal fear.
Yeah, it sets the stakes instantly. And we find out pretty fast why he's trapped. His captors, they don't want money. They want intel. They need the location of, well, something or someone called roulette. And that one word, that's the lever they just keep pulling.
Right. And what really struck me from the review wasn't just the physical trap, but this psychological layer they add really early on. Jeremy finds a CB radio in the box, which is kind of amazing, right? Suddenly he can talk, but only to this other guy locked in a similar box. Facing the exact same timer, same demands, it turns what could be a monologue into this really unsettling back and forth.
And it gets bigger than just the van, doesn't it? The review mentioned that while they're talking on the radio, desperately you hear snippets of news reports in the background.
Yeah, reports about car bombs going off around D.C. So his personal nightmare is suddenly part of this huge, national security crisis. It really ramps up the idea that roulette is incredibly important. The source definitely emphasizes that. Jeremy has information he has to protect, no matter the torture, physical or mental. It makes you, the viewer, constantly ask, what could possibly be worth this?
Okay, so let's get into the filmmaking challenge here, because the source material really hammers this point home. Break commits to its premise. Almost the entire movie, we're stuck in that box with Jeremy. That's a huge risk, isn't it? The whole thing lives or dies based on that one actor.
It really is the ultimate tightrope walk for an actor. And honestly, I was impressed by how the reviewer put it. They didn't just say Dorff was okay, they said excellent. Specifically praising him because, as the only person really on screen, he really stretches himself and produces an engaging and believable performance. That's high praise.
Yeah, for a role like that, basically just him in a box, it means he had to convey everything, the fear, the pain, the thinking, without chewing the scenery. But that's only half of it. What about the camera? How do you film that?
That's the million-dollar question for this kind of film, right? How do you make a space not much bigger than a coffin visually interesting for an hour and a half? Gabe Torres, the director, who the reviewer admits they didn't really know, and yeah, probably most people didn't, he had to get creative. You can't just set up a camera and leave it there. But the review highlights some real innovation. Despite the tight space, they called the film accomplished and polished, and they noted a surprising range of shots. Apparently, the camera sees the box from almost all angles, and crucially, these shots are mixed up enough to keep it fresh.
Okay, but hold on. Almost all angles of a clear box. I mean, how truly innovative can that be? Isn't that just covering the scene?
Well, I think what's interesting there is what it suggests about how they shot it. You're forced into extreme close-ups, right? Not just his face, but like his hands gripping the side, the condensation from his breath on the plastic, the way light hits it. To get that surprising range the reviewer mentioned, Torres probably had to use specific lenses, maybe wide angles used up close to distort the space, making it feel huge 1 second and suffocating the next. The fact that the reviewer called it fresh suggests they weren't just doing the obvious static shots you might expect. It seems like the constraint actually forced a different kind of visual creativity, focusing on texture, light, and Dorff's smallest physical reactions.
Right. So the limitation becomes the source of the style, in a way. You expect it to be visually boring, but instead they use the claustrophobia to make you notice tiny details, which ramps up the tension. But speaking of tension, this leads to the big danger with any single location film, especially one pushing 90 minutes. Doesn't it just run out of steam, run out of ideas?
That's always the risk. But this is where Break apparently really delivered. The source review says it overcame that potential problem with a frantic pace. Basically, if you can't move the character, you make the crisis move fast.
Okay, so how do they keep it frantic? It wasn't just quick cuts, was it? It was something structural.
Exactly. The review points to the timer itself. It wasn't set for, an hour, or even 30 minutes, it was set to count down in these really short, sharp bursts. 4 or 5 minutes was typical, apparently. Now think about that for a second. Why 4 minutes? A long countdown lets the audience breathe, maybe think too much. 4 minutes, that's constant pressure, nonstop crisis.
Ah, okay. So it creates this feeling of, like, perpetual panic. You barely survive one countdown, one event, and bam, you only have a few minutes before the next thing hits. That structure, those short bursts, it doesn't just keep the tension high. It feels like it's constantly accelerating it.
It's actually a pretty clever way to generate energy when your character is physically stuck, and the review connects this relentless pace directly to two things working together: Dorff's performance, which had to constantly react and evolve, and what they called a quite brilliant sound design and soundtrack.
The sound must have been absolutely critical. I mean, in a confined space like that, every little noise gets amplified, right? The silence, the ticking clock, the crackle of that CB radio.
Definitely. The sound probably does a huge amount of the psychological heavy lifting. And connecting this back to the overall experience, the reviewer made an interesting point. They said the frantic pace almost acts like a shield. Things happen so fast, you're so caught up in the immediate countdown that you have little time for anyone to ponder some of the clunkier plot devices until later.
Huh. So the speed hides the plot holes. That's actually a pretty smart observation about how genre films can work. You're too busy gripping the armrest to ask her, wait, how did they get a working CB radio in there?
Pretty much. You only start asking those questions after the credits roll.
Okay, so the pacing is like armor. But even armor can have weak spots. And this seems to bring us to the main criticism in the review, the thing that kind of let the air out a bit. The reviewer just flat out said it. I worked out very early on where the film was going and how it would end. Ouch.
Yeah, that's always a risk with high-concept thrillers, isn't it? Does the journey make up for knowing the destination? And the reviewer, without spoiling anything, definitely felt a bit of disappointment considering the strength and innovation they'd seen earlier. It sounds like they loved the ride, but were underwhelmed by the final reveal because they saw it coming.
It feels like those plot points, the how of his capture, the things the fast pace kind of glossed over, maybe they only really start to niggle when the ending confirms a suspicion you already had. That takes you out of the immersion, I guess.
It can, yeah. But, we should also remember that sometimes predictable twists are part of the genre's comfort food. The reviewer might have been hoping for something as unique as the setup. So the final twist, finding out about Roulette, who's really behind it all, must rely on more familiar thriller ideas. Which means the film's real strength isn't the surprise ending, but the raw intensity of getting there.
And that intensity ultimately saved it for the reviewer.
Yeah.
Despite seeing the end coming, the final word was positive. They found it very enjoyable. An effective thriller, even with a slightly telegraphed payoff. So the bottom line was simple. Break is recommended.
Yeah, and I think that tells us something important. The core concept, the execution Dorff's performance, that relentless pacing it, was all strong enough to make up for a less than shocking conclusion. They made the experience so visceral, so immediate, that the actual plot mechanics became less important than just surviving those 90 minutes in the box with him.
Okay, so let's wrap this up for you listening. What we've really seen here is how Break proves that tight constraints can actually fuel creativity. We talked about the power of Stephen Dorff's solo performance. We saw how Gabe Torres managed to find visual interest in, well, a box. And maybe most importantly, we looked at how that super fast, short burst pacing, those 4-minute timers in the sound design, kept the engine running and even papered over some plot cracks.
Right. And maybe here's something to chew on after this. The whole premise hinges on Jeremy holding on to this vital information regarding Roulette, enduring unbelievable stress. So if the reviewer found the execution amazing but the twist predictable, maybe that predictability was, in a way, deliberate. Like, did the filmmakers choose a familiar ending structure specifically to maximize the intensity of the journey itself without complicating it? And if they did, does that incredibly tense, claustrophobic ride still succeed in making you ask yourself that original question? How would you cope in that box knowing the world outside might be falling apart?
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into Break. We'll catch you on the next one.